you've been warning about these animal markets, these meat markets, wet markets in China and elsewhere and the US for a long time. People are finally starting to pay attention.
This is no mystery. This was forecast. This was predicted. In 2002, China had an outbreak of SARS that became an epidemic. It went all over the world. Hundreds of people died. Thousands were infected. And it incubated and was originally transmitted at a wet market in China. After that, China said, oh, we're going to stop the wet markets. And months later, they forgot about it and they reneged on that. And here we are, 17 years later with a rehash, except that this is even more virulent, it's more transmissible, and it's turned our global economy absolutely upside down.
I mean, it is a learning opportunity for the rest of the world. Animal welfare advocates like yourself have been warning about this a long, long time, as well as public health officials. But now, it should have the whole world's attention.
I can't think of anything bigger that's happened in my lifetime in terms of an economic effect and, to a degree, even though it's quite unclear where we're going on this, what the public health effect is. But thousands have died. Tens of thousands are likely to die in the United States. We've lost trillions of dollars as a global economy. It's changed our social behavior. All for what? For a minor transaction at an open air market in China for a food item that's a wild animal product, when we have plenty of other food options in the world. This is not a necessary industry for China or any part of the world. And we know what a great health risk this poses. To think of the asymmetrical circumstance, a minor transaction, somebody buying a pangolin or a bat or a civet cat, and having a multi-trillion-dollar effect on our economy with hundreds of thousands of people globally perhaps dying before we're done. Can you imagine something that is more consequential from some little tiny act that we could consider frivolous in the world?
How solid is the evidence that the meat market, the wet market in China, is the source of this virus? Because, there are a lot of different conspiracy theories floating around about who released it and why. Make the case.
It's nothing new. 60 to 70% of infectious diseases that afflict human beings started in animals. We have a whole history of them. I can run through them, and so many of your listeners know what those are. The reality is the major scientific organizations, including the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the very prominent doctor who's been helping be the face of this in the United States, Dr. Fauci, said this is where it started. And it should be no mystery to anybody. And we've been warning about it. We've been screaming. We've been stomping our feet. We've been raising our hands saying, eliminate the wet markets is going to spawn the next pandemic. And it's done exactly that.
You, in all likelihood, started looking at this not from a public health issue, but animal welfare issue. Describe for me the conditions in those markets, why they are breeding grounds for these kinds of viruses, and the cruelty that is inherent in their operation.
Well, the cruelty starts sometimes with the capture of the animals from the wild, maybe killing a mother animal and taking the offspring, or capturing the animal in an inhumane way, then long distance transport, and then landing at a market where they're kept in a cage that's barely larger than their bodies. They can see other animals being killed in front of them. They are butchered without any kind of stunning or any loss of consciousness that's stipulated under our federal humane slaughter standards and rules. The whole experience is just torture for the animals. It's also against our values about conservation, because some of these species are rare, like pangolins, the most trafficked animal in the world. Others are just barbarically treated. And again, all for what? For a little strange little delicacy at times for somebody. And then we're putting the entire world at risk, our economy and our health. I can't think of anything bigger in the United States since maybe World War II in terms of its effect on our social behavior, our economy. It's as big as it gets.
The Chinese, after the virus outbreak, sort of shut down their economy in their country, announced that these wet markets, these meat markets, would be shut down. Now we're seeing reports of them reopening. There's a story in the LA Times today about how the Chinese government has invested in this as economic development for rural areas. Are you confident that that these things can be shut down for good, or is it going to take more radical action on our part and other nations' part?
No, I don't think we can trust the Chinese government on this. They made the same promises after the SARS outbreak in 2002 and 2003. It's amazing that they're already pulling back on the commitment just days after they made it, as the global circumstance with the advance of COVID-19 has accelerated. You would have thought that they would maybe do so if they were being intelligent about it after the world's focus has left them. But the world's focus is on them. And that's why I'm excited about the idea of the US Senate, perhaps some key lawmakers introducing legislation to address live markets in the United States and other parts of the world to the extent that they can, urging the World Health Organization to take action. The Australian Prime Minister just yesterday demanded that China address these wet markets. So I don't think we've heard the final word on this.
You work with Congress a lot. So are you saying that you're aware of legislation that's being crafted or at least thought about so far?
Absolutely. There are letters that have already been sent to the Chinese ambassador to the United States, urging him to use his influence to get the rest of the government to actually stop these wet markets from operating and then to enforce that law. And then I think there's going to be authorizing legislation. Obviously, we can't control in the United States what China does, but we can send an important signal by stopping live markets in the United States. And our live markets are real, and wild animals are sold in major urban communities in the United States where frogs or turtles, some of which are imported from Taiwan and other parts of Asia. This has got to stop. But what it will do is if we enact it, it will not only spare these animals tremendous cruelty in the United States and protect us, but it will also set a standard that we as the United States are not asking China and Thailand and Laos and other countries to do anything or to do something that we ourselves are not willing to do. It's very similar to the dog and cat meat issue. The Congress, at our urging, passed a ban on killing dogs and cats for meat for human consumption in the United States. We just got that done 2 years ago. We did it because there was a burgeoning market in the US, but we also did it to show that, again, we're willing to do this, you should too.
It is a learning, excuse me, sorry, let me ask this again. Shutting down wet markets in Chinatowns in the US is one thing, taking on the meat industry is another. And you've battled with them over issues of animal welfare and public health regarding factory farm operations, factory food operations. How likely is it that what's going on now will eventually affect those kind of operations? Is this a learning moment that would sink in?
Well, we've been warning about wet markets in China and other parts of the world, including the US, for years. Now, sadly, the chickens have come home to roost. But we've also been equally warning about the overuse of antibiotics on America's factory farms. 80% of all classes of antibiotics, the ones that we use, that we give to our parents and our kids and everybody in between, these antibiotics are being given to animals on a daily basis, and it's promoting the growth of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And that means that the antibiotics that we need to save ourselves when we get sick are going to be rendered useless. So in a different way, it's not creating a new disease. What it's doing, it's rendering the classes of treatment that we have that are life-saving useless against these pathogens. So I think the power of the factory farming lobby, the pharmaceutical lobby, the veterinary industry, they all have a vested interest in continuing this. I think it's going to be a long battle, but I'm astonished that we are so short-sighted that we're not looking seriously at a policy solution on that issue.
You and the organizations you represented sound the alarm bell a couple times a year, every time there's some kind of a meat recall. I mean, these factory farm operations, the giant meat plants, they are like a petri dish for disease, and meat has to be treated like toxic waste.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just the overuse of antibiotics, but there are hormones that are a threat to our health. There is also salmonella and the other bacteria, other pathogens that that, get into the meat and we consume it. And there are millions sickened every year by the meat that we eat. And you might say, well, yes, some plant products as well, but there's something different about this in terms of the intensity of it, and that these pathogens can live in the animals.
Now that people are stuck at home, isolated, they got time to think, seems to be an opportune moment to think about their diets overall and how making small changes can help the planet in very positive ways. I know you don't want to lecture people about what they should or shouldn't eat because people get their dander up about that, but it is a learning opportunity here, I would think.
It's a learning opportunity, and food choices are important, right? They're important for our own health. They're important for the planet's health. They're important for animals. I mean, animals are stuck in the mix here. And many of these slaughterhouses and factory farms are very removed from our daily experience. If we get a close look at what's happening and what happens to the animals and the systemic mistreatment, then we layer on the effects of food safety concerns that are so prevalent. We look at the environmental impacts. I mean, animal agriculture is one of the biggest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. You think of 9 billion animals every year raised and slaughtered for food in the US. Think of all the waste that comes from those factory farms that goes into our waterways and putrefies the air. I mean, this is not an abstraction. This is something that every one of us should be thinking about, because it's a matter of self-interest for us, for our families, our community, our country, the planet. And I don't hesitate to say people should think about this because it's so central to our survival. And if we're conscious about animals, we also must be thinking about their well-being as well.
I mean, animal welfare and human health and well-being are inextricably linked. It's always been that way.
Our lives have always been bound together with animals, whether we realize it or not. And this horrid mistreatment of wild animals at these live animal markets is an indicator of how things really go wrong when we mistreat animals. That's what's happening, in a different way with different manifestations on our factory farms. We are treating these animals like things and objects, and there are big consequences for our own public health, for animal health, for planetary health. And I think there are big moral questions about how we should be treating other sentient creatures. These animals have lives that matter to them, and we should be conscious, especially because we have choices in our diets that we can make, choices that when we go more plant-based, it's going to be healthier for us as individuals.
Two other animal welfare issues I want to touch on while I have you. What's happening with animal welfare, pets, dogs, cats in the US? Can you make generalizations about shelters? I know in New York, we've seen reports of all the animals are adopted, the shelters are empty. That's not the case here. Are there general observations you can make?
I think it's uneven around the country, and it's still playing out. But many shelters have put the word out that they are ceasing operations or limiting operations, and many people have rushed in to foster animals and adopt them. So there are definitely some very positive stories. In other cases, I mean, animals are being euthanized because operations are ceasing and there aren't people to help them. I think one of the bigger issues that's going to go forward is when we have tens of millions of people who've lost their jobs and they're facing economic insecurity. What are they going to do with their animals? There are costs that come with having an animal, the food that they eat, the medical services that they need. And I'm really worried about that on a go-forward basis, because when the human circumstance is more troubled and difficult, then it becomes tougher for people to care for animals.
I've seen reports out of Africa that tourism dollars are so important to their economies. And it looks like the security forces that are in place to prevent poachers from killing endangered species, rhinos, elephants, things of that sort, they're not going to be able to be paid anymore. I'm really worried about what's going to happen there.
Well, you're right to be worried about the African countries and their great dependence on ecotourism. It's a big driver because the animals are an incredible draw. They produce billions of dollars in economic activity. It's the chance of a lifetime for someone to see an elephant or a giraffe or a lion in their native habitat. And with the transportation restrictions that we have, with the fear of flying, many of those safaris are off. Now, at the same time, a lot of the trophy hunters, about 80% of the trophy hunters in the world that go to Africa and to Asia to kill big game animals, are from the United States. So that is also falling off. But overall, this is a concern. And Oh, George, I would say that the circumstances for animals are very uneven now in terms of the consequences that COVID-19 has had for them. There are some beneficial things for animals. There are some detrimental things because animals are everywhere. They're bound up in our economy. They're in the food chain. We use them for testing. There are a lot more animal tests to find the next vaccine. We use them in so many ways, and their fate is bound up and tied to our own.